So yeah, good morning. So my name's Maxim. I'm Maxim Jago. I am a filmmaker and author. I write the classroom in a book for Premiere Pro. And I share my time between making films and traveling around the world teaching people how to make films. And I record a lot of video training and so on. And I'm an active filmmaker, so I have a lot of opinions about the features that are added to editing applications. In fact, I won the Best Director Award in Monaco in May, so very proud of. Thank you very much. So I'd like to focus in this presentation on, I suppose, the features that really stand out for me in this new next release in Premiere Pro. The first one that for me is a really big deal is the new masking and tracking feature for special effects. This is a really powerful feature. It's going to change the way you work with effects in Premiere Pro. So to illustrate this, I've got this shot. Here's this guy. I'm just going to, let's just solo this section of the audio so I can scrub through. You can see this. And here's this guy. And let's say we've shot this video, but actually, see where he's on camera. And let's say the director just wants to pick out this guy's face and either put a soft focus on or a special effect, pretty much any special effect you want. But if I wanted to do this historically, I suppose I would need to duplicate the layer and then maybe use a track matte key to separate out the two layers and apply the effect to the second layer. Or I could use an adjustment layer, and it would be the same thing. I'd put the effect on the adjustment layer. Those options still exist, but it's much easier now if you want to achieve this kind of effect because we have this masking and tracking feature built in. So I'm going to go to my effects list, and I'm going to choose, I'll make this really visual so you can see it. I'm going to get the three-way color corrector. This is kind of my go-to color correction effect in Premiere Pro. It's GPU accelerated. It'll render in 32-bit if you want. It's YUV native. It's a good color correction effect. And let me go to my effect controls panel. Here we go. I'll just pull this over and resize a little bit. And I'm going to make this really obvious. So I'm going to set the color wheels here into master mode, and I'm going to give this something like a blue tint. I'm always joking, I never get hired as a grading artist after doing these presentations, and I never know why. But anyway, there it is. So now that I've applied this effect, I'm just going to scroll up a little so you can see, just under the effect name, you'll notice that we have these three buttons. There's the ellipse, the rectangle, and the new pen tool. If you have an existing subscription, you'll have seen the ellipse and the rectangle, but you won't have seen the pen. So what these three buttons do is add a mask specifically to the effect. And it's a mask that you can animate manually, or you can animate automatically by motion tracking the contents. So let's do that. I'm going to select the free draw Bezier, and I'm just going to click and drag and click and drag. And I'm going to do this pretty randomly. You could probably do this with a little bit more finesse than me. And you can see, if I just deselect that mask, you can see I've created this crazy shape. Let's say, as a director, I think that's exactly what this production needs. But maybe I want to put some softening in, so I'm going to select the mask, and we have this new feathering control built into the mask controls in the program monitor. And I'll just add some softening. You'll have seen this kind of control in After Effects if you've worked with the variable feathering on masks. And if I'm happy with that, just under the mask name, you'll notice this is mask number 1 because I can have multiple masks if I like, and I can have them intersect and interact. I'm just going to click this button, Track Selected Mask Forward. And Premiere Pro is going to optically track the contents of the shot and follow this guy's face and move and animate and resize and rotate the mask. So this is really high resolution media, so it's taking a little time for my machine to access the content. But you can see what's happening here. I'll just let it do a few frames and then I'll scrub through so you can see. And while this is happening, I might as well draw your attention to this track backwards button. If you are working with media where somebody comes into the frame, you can start tracking in the middle of the shot and then track forwards and then track backwards to have them arrive and leave. So let's just stop that there, and you'll notice that at this moment he's moving way too fast. It's a bit of a whip pan on the camera. He's turning his head. He's changed the shape of the visual reference, so the mask has slipped off. So it's very easy for me to drag this back into position, just like this, and get going again. And you can see as this is working, keyframes are being added in the effect controls panel. Anyway, you get the idea. So if I scrub through now, let me just deselect. There it is. It's following his face through the shot. Now in this case, it's not exactly high art, but you can see how easily you could use this to do things like mosaic out of face. Or my advice would be that because your eye is drawn to hard, clean edges, so if you put a mosaic over somebody, you're going to draw the attention of the audience. If you have someone in the middle distance, for example, when you're filming, you're going to capture the audience's attention when what you really want to do is push away the audience's attention. So you can create a soft focus effect using this technique, soften the edges of that soft focus effect, and it will just look like the person was never quite in focus. It actually pushes the eye away if there's areas of softness. So this is the masking and tracking. Now what's nice about this as well is that the masks that you create in Premiere Pro are fully compatible with After Effects. So if you send this work over to After Effects will receive the mask, and you can use all of the more nuanced controls in After Effects. Things like the variable feathering I mentioned earlier. It's all available, and you'll have the mask to work with. So it's really a really useful starting point, at least, if you want to do that more advanced work. So that's masking and tracking. Another new feature that I think is really brilliant, this is a really big deal for me as a filmmaker, is that we now have master clip effects. So an effect is just something that you apply to a clip to change the appearance of it or the sound of it. And historically, we would apply those effects either to an adjustment layer on the timeline, or you would apply it to a clip on the timeline. So I want to make a clear distinction between a clip in the bin, which I'm going to call a master clip, and a clip on the timeline that I'm going to call either a sequence clip or a timeline instance of a clip. And we need to make this distinction very clearly. Now, if I double-click on any of these clips on the timeline, I'm actually going to open the timeline instance, not the original master clip. And that means if I apply an effect now, I'm just updating the clip on the timeline. But you'll notice I've got several clips here. You see these orange items on the timeline. These are actually different parts of the same original clip. So wouldn't it be great if I could apply an effect once instead of multiple times and be able to adjust the settings for it in just one location? And that's what the master clip effects allow us to do. So I'm going to press F for frame. That's the keyboard shortcut for match frame. And now what I'm looking at is the master clip from the bin. Looks the same, but it's actually a different instance of the clip. And just to illustrate this feature, I'm going to get my effect controls panel and I'm going to pull it into its own frame. So now on the left we've got the master clip. On the right we have our program monitor with the sequence clip in it. And in the middle I have my effect controls. And I'm going to go to my effects panel, and I think I'm going to use curves. I work with curves a lot. I'm going to take this RGB curves effect, and rather than drag this onto the timeline, I'm going to drag it into the source monitor. In fact, you can drag them directly onto clips in the bin as well if you like, and this will work with presets too. So now I've added the effect to the source monitor, and I've got the controls here in the effect controls panel, so I'll just resize this a little bit. And I think I'm going to just increase the contrast a little, turn up the brightness, and you can see that we've got a different scaling happening in the program monitor. Maybe I'll cool this down a little, pull down the red. Let's just lift up the mid-tones a little bit. So you can see I'm getting this more filmic result, and this has been applied to every instance of this clip. So I have this much more interesting result, but it's a single set of controls. And the master clip effects will interact quite naturally with the sequence clip effects. So, for example, I was working on a piece recently where I had interviews for a music video, interviews with the director, interviews with the singer, and I just applied effects to the interview pieces because it was one long clip, and then every instance of that person's interview automatically has the look and feel I want. Imagine if you're shooting two-shot reversal dialogue. It's perfect. If one camera needs calibrating, you can send that over to SpeedGrade, use SpeedGrade's integrated shot matching feature, create a lookup table from SpeedGrade, throw that onto your master clip, and everything updates. And you'll notice here, I've got a little red mark underneath the effects icon, and that tells me that a master clip effect has been applied not to the sequence clip, but to the master clip it comes from. So it's dynamically updating. Now, one thing you notice as well is we've got this scaling thing going on in the sequence. And the reason for this is that our media is actually much higher resolution than the media, than the timeline settings, the sequence settings. So let's just take a look at that. If I look at my sequence, I can see that this is 1920 by 1080. But if I click on one of these and choose Reveal in Project, I can see this is 5K media. So we're working with native 5K media. This is R3D files straight from the RED camera. And if anybody's missed this, if you weren't working with RED, you can right-click on RED clips, and you can go into the source settings, and you have full access to the Debayer controls for R3D files. And one of the features that's just been announced for Premiere Pro is that if you have the right GPU hardware, so if you meet the minimum specifications for your graphics card, Premiere Pro can now debayer RED footage and a number of other camera raw formats using the GPU rather than the CPU. So this gives you much better performance for reading things like R3D files and so on. It's very powerful. Historically, for example, with RED, you'd want to use something like a RED Rocket card. It's an additional piece of hardware that goes in your computer. So it's a really big deal that we can now have the GPU help with this work. So this is another way of adjusting the color. Of course, I could lift the midtones on this, and that would update as well. But what's happening here, of course, is that I've got 5K media on a 1080 timeline. My timeline is smaller, my sequence is smaller. And by default, Premiere Pro is just centering the shot, and it's cropping the edges. And coincidentally, a lot of people are shooting this way. So you go out and you shoot 6K even, or if you're shooting with some of these Blackmagic cameras, they shoot 2.5, 2.7K. But on set, you frame for a 1080 timeline, or if you're shooting 6K, you frame for a 4K timeline. And you shoot that way. And this means that when you get to post, you have wiggle room. You can reframe the shot and maintain perfect quality. You can even pan and scan inside the shot. If you're shooting for 1080, you can completely pan and scan around inside the shot, and it means you can go much faster through production. You just need to set the camera position and not worry too much about the framing. It's a very interesting approach to production. But now that I have this media set at so much higher resolution, I need to shrink it down. And historically, I would do this by right-clicking and choosing scale to frame size. And that's fine. I've scaled down the shot, and we're ready to cut. That's okay. The problem with this is that I've effectively, in a virtual sense, I've effectively re-rasterized my shot at 1080. I've thrown away a massive amount of picture information. So if I zoom in now, if I scale up the clip, it's going to look soft. And that's the quick fix solution, scale to frame size. We've had it for years. But if I turn this off, I also now, this is a new feature, have this option to set to frame size. And just look at the effect controls panel before I turn this on. If you look at the motion controls, you see I've got scale and it's set to 100%. If I choose set to frame size, this is now changing to 37.5%. So Premiere Pro is using the original resolution, but it's scaling it down with a keyframeable control in the effect controls panel. So now, if I want to, I can pan and scan around inside, and I know that my range is going to be between 37.5% and 100%. And as long as I keep within that range, I'm going to have perfect picture quality. I'm going to get a 1-to-1 pixel ratio. So it's a tiny little adjustment, but I think an important one if you're working with mixed resolution media. It's a new feature added very, very recently. So another big deal feature that a lot of people have been asking for Premiere Pro is a workflow for multi-project editing. And Adobe have just now implemented for this next release of Premiere Pro a fantastic workflow. So let's say, for example, I'm going to go to my media browser, and let me just resize a little bit. I'll put my effect controls panel back. And in the media browser, I can create favorites, so I can have specific locations that I want to jump to on my storage drives. And I can now create multiple media browser panels. So you can have as many media browsers open as you like, and they can be sitting looking at specific locations. And this means, of course, if you're working in a network storage environment and somebody is managing ingest for you, you can just wait for the stuff to pop up. It'll just appear there, and you can leave the window open all the time. But the media browser isn't just for importing media. By the by, if you're not familiar with the media browser, the reason you would use it is that it dramatically simplifies the ingest process. Particularly if you're working with file types that you can't browse easily in the operating system, or if you're working with fragmented file types where you've got different parts of the media in different folders. So for example, if you have R3D files from Red, how are you going to view that in Windows or Mac OS? You basically can't. You need to come into an editing system to be able to decode it and to read it. But if you're working with something like XDCAM media, where the video and audio are in separate folders, which part do you ingest? Well, the media browser handles that for you, and it displays all of your content as regular, what I would call regular video and audio clips. And you can just drag them into your project. But now we've got an advanced way of interacting with existing projects. So here, for example, I've got a bunch of media, and I can go in and I can look at this source, and here you go, here's some shots. I'm just going to resize a little so you can see more clearly. Let's get some big thumbnails. And I can view this content. I can double click and open it in the source monitor. So I'm just using Premiere Pro as a browser. But notice I've got some demo project files here as well. And let's say I like this discovery media, but I think I want part of the sequence. So I'm going to double click on the project file to open it up. And now I'm looking at the interior of this project file. Now it's worth mentioning at this point that Premiere Pro is designed around the paradigm of being non-destructive. So nothing you do in Premiere Pro will change or modify or alter or damage your media files. And in this case, we're accessing a different project file, so we need to make sure that we don't make any changes to it. And that protection for your other files is built into this workflow. So I've got source, and here are my various bins, and you can see there's some contents here. I've got some aerial footage. Of course, that one's offline. It's in a different server. Let's have a look and see what I've got here. Here's some media. So this is inside my project now. But if I go back up, I've also got access to the sequences. And if I double click to open this sequence, a couple of things are going to happen. The first thing that happens is the sequence opens in the source monitor in this project, or rather in Premiere Pro as it's open right now. I haven't yet imported anything. If I want to, I can take that sequence and just drag it in or right click and choose to ingest and bring that into my project, and any clips that are in the sequence will come with it. There's a rule in Premiere Pro that if you have a clip in a sequence, that clip must be in your project panel, or it must be in a bin. So it's a kind of protection to make sure that you don't have sequences with missing media. But look at this. There's a second thing that happens, which is that the contents of that sequence are now being displayed automatically in a new timeline panel. Here's the original timeline that I was looking at just now. That's the one in this project. And here's the one in the sequence that I'm just browsing. And you'll see that the source monitor and that timeline are ganged together. So now, what can I do with this? Well, I can do a lot. First of all, I can't make any changes to the contents of this. You see, if I drag clips around, I can't trim, I can't make any changes, but I can access it. So, for example, I could select some clips. Let's just choose these items here. I can press Control-C, that would be Command-C on Mac OS. And then I can go to my other sequence. I'll just drag over to the end here. Let's choose a location, Control-V, Command-V. I've pasted these onto my timeline, so I can copy and paste. But I can even drag and drop. So I'm going to take this timeline, I'm going to drag this down to a separate panel. So the top panel is my current sequence. The bottom panel is the one that I'm browsing from the other project. And here are my clips that I just selected. I'm just going to drag these into the timeline. So now I can have multiple projects open at the same time. I can browse their contents. I can copy and paste. I can drag and drop. I can incorporate the contents into my current project. But there's no danger of me damaging the other project. There's no danger of me making changes to it, which I like. I'm a big believer in not having to worry about that kind of stuff. So that's a big deal thing. What else have I got here? It's a huge amount of stuff. First of all, if you are working with transparency, see if I've got a logo or a graphic somewhere that I can illustrate this with. Let's have a look. Well, maybe I'll just make one. So, I'm going to make a quick title. Let's call this first title. And I'll just type a word in here so we can see it. Let's just call this action. And I'll choose one of the presets. Nice and big, or maybe I'll go for this one. So let's say that's my, my perfect title for this project. If I drag this into the source monitor, what I'm seeing, instead of that transparency, is black pixels. This is effectively what you would get if you laid this onto the timeline. But Premiere Pro now has the option to see a transparency grid. So here I choose transparency grid, and now I know what's really going on with my media. This is very useful if you're working with animated contents, maybe from After Effects or any kind of time where you've got media with alpha channel information. You can actually see what you're getting before you lay it onto the timeline. And it's silly, but historically the way I would have achieved this in Premiere Pro is probably by putting a brightly colored color matte on the timeline and just placing the clip in front. You're all nodding. This is what you've done as well, right? You make a bright red or bright pink even, and then you can see very clearly. Now we have this for both the timeline and the source monitor. I can turn this on in the program monitor. Exactly the same option. Here it is. So there's another big feature. There's a ton of those little updates, little improvements that give you more flexibility in your editing. So another new feature is under the File menu. We have the Project Manager. This is old news. We've had this for a while. But it's a newly designed Project Manager with a fantastic new transcode feature. So we can consolidate and transcode our projects. So there's a couple of options here. If I choose to collect the files, all I'm going to do is take my media from wherever it is on the computer, wherever it is on my network, whatever storage locations I've got, pull it all together and copy it into a new folder, create a new project file that links to that media. And that's fine if you're collaborating or you're moving your media or you're archiving it. But if I choose to consolidate and transcode, I get a bunch of really useful new options. So transcode, of course, just means change the codec, re-encode it, convert the format. So here under the match menu, I can specify when I convert this media whether I'm going to match my sequence resolution and frame rate, my sequence settings, or my individual clip settings. So let's say you're working with mixed media, mixed formats, you can maintain the original image resolution. Or if I want to use a preset that I've created that's specific to my workflow in-house. Once I've chosen that, I choose a file format and a codec, and Premiere Pro will convert all of the clips that I select, either all of the clips in my project or just the ones in my selected sequences, and it'll convert them to whichever format I choose. And effectively, I'm using a mezzanine codec then. A mezzanine codec, if you like, is a standard codec that you apply, that you use for all of your media for a project. It's very common to use a mezzanine codec if you're working with a media server that demands it. So it might be, for example, that your in-house mezzanine codec is DNxHD. Or it might be that you're using ProRes. Or, in this case, a new option is that we can choose to use, if I set this to QuickTime, the GoPro Cineform codec. I'll talk about that just in a second. But before I do, the question is, why would you bother? Why would you do this conversion? Well, one reason is that your in-house standard requires it, and that's okay. A lot of big organizations use mezzanine codecs. But another reason might be that your machine is really struggling to play back the files you have. Because while Premiere Pro is happy to make use of your hardware and give you brilliant playback performance for things like RED files or ARRI RAW or Cinema DNG from Blackmagic, your hard drives might really struggle to give you the data fast enough because they just might not be that quick. Your CPU might just not be that fast. The amount of memory you might have might just not be that big. So then what do? You end up rendering a lot, right? So with this option, we can transcode all of our media to a codec and format that's designed for playback in post-production, so it's easier to get better performance. And Premiere Pro can very easily link and relink between your original full resolution native codec media and the version that you're using right now, transcoded. So it's a quick, easy way of improving playback performance on your machine. And there's another way of doing this as well. This is fantastically useful. And Adobe, by the way, doesn't need you to do this. You can carry on using the original media. It really is down to the power of your system. So let's say you've got a powerful editing system, but you're going to be on the road for a while, and you want to carry on editing. Why not transcode, use the copies while you're on the road, and then come back and relink on your main editing system to get that better performance? That's a reason why you would use this feature. So we've got all the options you'd expect here about which files you want to use, whether you're going to have handles, that sort of thing. But we've got this new option. This is native for playback and output from Premiere Pro, GoPro Cineform codec media. And the GoPro Cineform codec is great. It uses wavelet compression, which means that you can scale it down with very little CPU load. And that means you can go down to 1/16th resolution for playback. So again, imagine you've got an old rubbishy laptop, it's not very good quality, it's not very fast, it's not able to deal with high-resolution media. You can drop the playback resolution dramatically, still work with your original media resolution when you switch it back to full res. It's a very high-quality codec, and it supports alpha, and it supports very high-resolution media, 4K, 5K, 6K, and above. So it's a really good fit. Mac and PC, it's a really good fit for Premiere Pro and for editing. So we can have the alpha if we need it, but I don't need it. And when I click OK, I won't do it right now because it takes a little bit of time, you'll have duplicates of your media and a separate project file. But it's very easy in Premiere Pro to switch back and forth between the two. I did this recently with media that we shot. We shot a beautiful short film, and we shot it on the Sony F55, 4K RAW 16-bit. Those files are enormous. We shot 1.5 terabytes in 2 days. And the machine we were cutting on wasn't very powerful. So, in fact, on the F55, there's a number of cameras now that have 2 recorders, and we dual recorded XT Cam, and we cut with that and then switched to the 4K RAW. But just very quickly, because I need to hand over to the, looks like it's going to be, yes, the amazing Jason Levine. We also have this option on the timeline. So remember we had that 5K media? I can right-click on this media, and I can choose Render and Replace. And this will give me the same options for that individual item. And this works if you've got a dynamically linked After Effects composition in your sequence as well. So again, maybe your machine is struggling to render the results of that After Effects composition inside the timeline on Premiere Pro. Don't worry about it. Render and Replace. And now you'll have a codec that's great for playback, totally smooth, no problem at all. It's not quite the same as rendering, because rendering is the results of that part of your timeline. In this case, we're replacing that individual clip with a video file. But if I change my mind and I decide that I want to make changes to that dynamically linked After Effects composition, I can choose this option, Restore Unrendered, and Premiere Pro will switch back to using the original item. And it's the same thing here. Let's say you're working on a low-power machine and you're working in standard definition. A lot of people still are. And you've got 6K media, and you've got a machine that can play standard def no problem, but 6K, forget it. Well, you can render and replace, and then when you finish editing, switch back to the original and output your file. You get the maximum quality. Okay, so there are a ton of other additional features. I'd encourage you to have a look on the other side of the stage. We've got machines that you can play with hands-on. I'll be here for a little while if you want to ask some questions. But I will hand over now to the most awesome, most excellent Jason Levine, who's going to show you new features in Photoshop. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you.